One cold morning in 1871, an entire orphanage awoke to silence. 42 children who had gone to sleep the night before were simply gone. Their shoes were left neatly by their beds, their blankets still warm, but not a single child remained. No screams, no struggle, no trace. Just an empty building and the unanswered question: how can dozens of children vanish overnight without the world noticing? This channel isn't for everyone, but if you believe these forgotten horrors should never stay buried, hit subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The town itself was small, almost forgettable, the kind of settlement you might pass through without even noticing. Nestled among rolling fields and dense woods, it held barely 200 souls farmers who tilled the land, shopkeepers who lived above their stores, a single pastor who tried to keep his flock united through hardship. Life was slow, predictable, and defined by routine. The ringing of the church bell marked Sundays. The dusty road carried wagons in and out, and the smell of fresh bread often drifted from the one bakery that served everyone. At the center of this modest community stood the orphanage, a tall, weather-worn building with gray stone walls and shuttered windows. To outsiders, it seemed respectable, a place of refuge for children who had already known too much loss. Inside, the matron carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had dedicated her life to service. Neighbors remembered her soft-spoken manner, her neat black dresses, and her reputation for piety. When she attended church, she was always the first to kneel, the last to rise. Families in the town believed she was performing a holy duty, caring for children abandoned by war, illness, or poverty. Few questioned how she managed to feed so many mouths with so little visible income. Few wondered why the children were rarely seen outside the orphanage gates, their laughter and play oddly absent from the dusty lanes where most youngsters roamed. Merchants recalled her steady business. She purchased flour, cornmeal, salted pork, and medicinal herbs in quantities that made sense only for someone running a household of dozens. Yet she always paid in full and in cash, leaving no debts and no reason for suspicion. Some nights, neighbors claimed, the glow of lanterns burned long after midnight in the upper windows of the orphanage. The matron would explain that many of the children struggled with nightmares and illness, that she often stayed awake to comfort them. These explanations were accepted without challenge. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked inside those stone walls. The town prided itself on its neighborly trust, but that same trust would later be seen as blindness. No one asked why the children rarely appeared at school. No one questioned why the matron declined invitations for them to attend fairs or festivals. The orphans became like shadows in the community, acknowledged, pitied, but never truly known. When their disappearance came, the shock was sharpened by guilt. It was as if the town had been sleepwalking for years, only to awaken one morning to find its innocence gone. The night of the vanishing began like any other. A cold wind swept down from the hills, rattling the shutters and bending the trees that lined the orphanage grounds. Inside, the halls were dimly lit by oil lamps, their flickering glow casting long shadows against the stone walls. The children finished their evening meal of thin broth and bread, recited their prayers under the watchful eye of the matron, and climbed into their narrow, iron-framed beds. Some whispered to one another, others clutched the small trinkets they kept hidden beneath their pillows' buttons, bits of ribbon, scraps of paper with faded words that reminded them of families they barely remembered. Slowly, the building grew quiet as one by one the children drifted into uneasy sleep. Outside, the townsfolk went about their own routines. A farmer returning from his fields saw a faint light moving across the orphanage yard, as though someone carried a lantern between the house and the woods. He thought little of it, assuming the matron was checking on the livestock or storing supplies. A shopkeeper's wife later claimed she heard a strange, rhythmic sound drifting through the night ere a low hum. almost like a chant, but when she stepped outside to listen closer, it was gone, replaced only by the rustle of leaves dot by dawn. The world inside the orphanage had changed forever. The first to arrive was a servant girl who came each morning to help with chores. When she pushed open the heavy doors, she was struck by the silence. The usual chorus of sleepy voices, the shuffle of bare feet, the murmurs of children waking, were absent. Room by room she searched, her lantern swinging wildly as panic grew. Beds were still neatly arranged, blankets half folded as if the children had been tucked in only moments before. Shoes rested in orderly rows by the doors. But not a single child remained. The matron was gone too. Her simple black shawl hung on its peg. Her prayer book still sat on the knitstand by her bed. No signs of struggle marked the rooms. No broken locks or shattered glass hinted at intrusion. It was as if 42 children had risen in the night and walked into the darkness together, guided by some unseen hand. Within hours, the alarm spread through town. Men abandoned their work in the fields to form search parties. Mothers wept openly in the churchyard, clutching their own children tighter. The pastor rang the bell again and again, its toll echoing through the valley like a summons to judgment. The search began with desperate urgency. Dozens of townsfolk fanned out across the countryside, combing fields, barns, and woodlands for any trace of the missing children. Lanterns bobbed in the pre-dawn mist as men called out names into the still air, listening for an answering cry that never came. Farmers brought their dogs, who sniffed eagerly at the ground around the orphanage, circling and whining, but refusing to follow any clear trail. Women gathered in the church, lighting candles and whispering prayers, while children clung to their mothers' skirts, too frightened to speak above a whisper dot. By midday, the search parties began to uncover the first strange signs. Just beyond the orphanage fence, in a patch of churned earth, they found dozens of small footprints. Bare feet, pressed into the mud, all heading in the same direction, toward the dense woods that bordered the north side of town. Some prints were deep and erratic, as though the children had been running, others perfectly straight, in tight formation, as though marching. The sight sent a chill through the men who discovered them. It looked less like a frantic flight, and more like an orderly procession dot. The trail led them into the woods, where the trees grew thick and the canopy blocked out much of the light. The prints continued for nearly half a mile before abruptly stopping at a clearing marked by an old moss-covered well. No signs of passage continued beyond that point. The ground was firm, the leaves undisturbed, as if the children had simply disappeared into thin air. The well itself was dry, long abandoned, its stones crumbling from years of neglect. Yet one of the searchers swore he heard a faint echo when he leaned over its mouth, not the hollow drip of water, but something like a whisper carried upward from the depths. Back at the orphanage, others uncovered details that deepened the mystery. In the kitchen, bowls of porridge sat untouched, as if prepared for the morning meal that never happened. On the matron's desk lay scraps of paper filled with hastily written lines of scripture, all from the book of Exodus, passages describing children led into the wilderness. In one margin, a phrase had been underlined 3 times in heavy ink, "And the little ones shall be delivered." By the time night fell again, fear gripped the town more tightly than hunger or exhaustion. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the matron had led the children away as part of a fanatical ritual. Others whispered of strangers seen on the roads in recent weeks, pale-faced men with wagons who asked too many questions. And a few, in hushed tones, insisted the children had been taken by something older than the town itself, some presence tied to the land long before the orphanage was ever built. The following days turned the town into a place of restless dread. Search parties pushed farther into the woods, some traveling for miles, but the trail remained cold beyond the abandoned well. Word spread to neighboring villages, and soon strangers arrived, curiosity seekers, opportunists, and even a handful of journalists eager to uncover a sensational story. Their presence only deepened the unease. Questions piled higher than answers. Where could 42 children have gone without leaving so much as a scrap of fabric, a cry for help, or a trail to follow? The sheriff, an aging man who had never faced anything larger than petty theft or a drunken brawl, tried to hold the community together. He posted notices in nearby towns, offered a modest reward, and sent riders to alert state officials. But as the days passed with no word, suspicion turned inward. Families who had trusted one another for years began to whisper behind closed doors. Who among them might know more than they admitted? Was it possible the children had been sold, hidden, or spirited away by someone within their own ranks? When the church convened an emergency gathering, the pastor spoke of sin and divine punishment. He urged the people to confess anything they might be hiding, insisting that God's wrath had descended upon them for reasons yet unseen. Several townsfolk wept openly, but no confessions came, only more fear. A widow claimed she had seen figures moving in the woods days before the disappearance, cloaked shapes carrying lanterns. A farmer swore he had found small handprints smudged in soot along the doorframe of his barn, though no child had set foot there. These stories spread quickly, and soon the entire town was haunted not just by the loss, but by the sense that they were being watched, stalked by something invisible. Investigators from the state finally arrived, young men in stiff uniforms with notebooks and skeptical expressions. They questioned everyone, searched every house, and inspected the orphanage room by room. What they found unsettled even the most rational among them. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the matron's chamber was a collection of letters, written in her careful hand, but addressed to no one in particular. They spoke of voices in the night, of children hearing their names whispered when no one stood nearby, of dreams so vivid that many awoke with scratches on their arms, as if they had been dragged through brambles in their sleep. In her final letter, written just 2 days before the vanishing, she described standing at the well in the woods and hearing a chorus of children's laughter rising from its depths. Officials dismissed these writings as the ravings of a woman collapsing under the strain of responsibility. Yet even they could not explain the orderly footprints, the sudden disappearance, or the strange silence that seemed to hang over the orphanage grounds like a shroud. By the end of their inspection, they had no suspects, no bodies, and no theory that could satisfy the growing panic. The case, for all its urgency, was already slipping toward the impossible. Weeks turned into months, and the mystery only deepened. With no children recovered and no signs of struggle, the town seemed frozen in a nightmare it could not wake from. But then strange reports began to trickle in from neighboring settlements. A farmer 2 towns over claimed he saw a line of children walking along a ridge at twilight, moving in eerie silence, their eyes fixed forward as if under a spell. A trapper swore he heard laughter deep in the forest one night, but when he searched the underbrush with his lantern, he found nothing but the sound of footsteps fading into the dark. The most unsettling account came from a young girl traveling with her family by wagon. She insisted that in the distance, just beyond the tree line, she saw a group of children standing together in the moonlight. She described them as pale, barefoot, and strangely calm, their faces turned toward her with expressions she couldn't quite recognize, neither joy nor sorrow, but something hollow, detached. When her father rushed to see what she was pointing at, the clearing was empty. No footprints marked the soft earth dot back in the orphanage town. Investigators uncovered more troubling details. In the cellar, behind stacks of preserved jars, they found symbols carved into the stone foundation circles, intersected with lines, shapes that resembled stars, crude figures of children holding hands. The markings were old, weathered, as if they had been there long before the orphanage was built. Some believed they were remnants of folk rituals brought by settlers. Others feared they were something far older, etched into the land itself. The pastor, desperate to give meaning to the chaos, declared the children had been taken as part of a covenant broken by the town's forefathers. He preached that their silence, their blindness to the matron's warnings, had invited darkness. A few townsfolk accepted his explanation, clinging to the idea that the vanishing was divine punishment. Others resisted, insisting the truth was more earthly, that someone had taken the children for profit, for labor, or for darker purposes too terrible to speak aloud. But as the years passed and no remains were ever found, the town's fear curdled into shame. Families moved away, unable to bear the whispers that followed them. Merchants closed their shops, fields went untended, and soon the once bustling settlement dwindled to a scattering of empty houses overtaken by weeds. The orphanage itself stood abandoned, its windows shattered, its halls echoing only with the wind. Travelers avoided it, muttering that on quiet nights they could still hear children's voices drifting from its empty rooms. Decades later, when the town had all but disappeared from maps, the legend of the 42 vanished orphans refused to die. Folklorists and newspapermen arrived with notebooks, eager to retell the mystery as a cautionary tale. Some framed it as a story of mass abduction, a crime so perfectly concealed that no evidence survived. Others leaned into the supernatural, describing the orphanage as cursed ground where the innocent were swallowed whole by forces beyond human comprehension. Each version only added layers to the myth until the original truth, whatever it had been, was buried beneath speculation. In the early 1900s, treasure hunters and amateur historians began to pick over the ruins of the orphanage. They found rusted bed frames, rotted furniture, scraps of paper so brittle they crumbled at the touch. Yet there were also discoveries that defied explanation. More of the strange symbols appeared carved into beams and doors, identical to those in the cellar, but etched with a precision that suggested careful hands. In one collapsed hallway, searchers uncovered dozens of small handprints pressed into the plaster, arranged in neat lines as though the children themselves had left a silent message before vanishing. By the 1950s, ghost hunters had claimed the site as one of Pennsylvania's most haunted places. Visitors spoke of hearing whispers in the dark, of feeling tugged at by unseen hands, of glimpsing pale faces in the shattered windows before they vanished into shadow. Some investigators swore they captured recordings of children singing lullabies in languages no one could identify. Others left abruptly, too shaken to continue, insisting the air itself pressed heavy against their chests. Like the weight of sorrow, local historians tried to separate fact from folklore, combing through archives for records of the missing. What they found only fueled the mystery. Census logs listed the orphanage children by name and age, right up until the year of their disappearance. But afterward, the records were curiously blank, as if the institution had never existed. Court documents and property deeds that should have mentioned the orphanage stopped abruptly in the 1870s. It was as though every trace of the building and its wards had been deliberately erased from official memory. To this day, some argue that the children were taken as part of a trafficking network, hidden away in wagons and dispersed across the country. Others believe the matron, whose body was never found, led them into the woods willingly, guided by the same voices she wrote of in her journals. Still others insist the land itself claimed them, that whatever lay beneath the mossy well had waited patiently for its offering, and on that night in 1871, it took everything it was owed. Even now, more than a century later, the fate of the 42 children lingers like a shadow over Pennsylvania's forgotten hills. The orphanage has long since collapsed, the town around it reclaimed by weeds and silence, yet the mystery has never been resolved. Some say their voices still echo at night, drifting between the trees like a hymn half remembered. Others believe the truth was buried deliberately, locked away by those who knew more than they dared to admit. What makes this Story Endure isn't just the horror of the disappearance, but the haunting realization that a whole community could lose its children and still never learn why. Were they stolen, sacrificed, or led into the dark by a trusted hand? The answers may never be uncovered. But the memory of 42 empty beds, of shoes left neatly in rows, reminds us how fragile safety can be. If this tale has given you chills, share it with someone who isn't afraid to confront the darkest corners of America's past. And tell me in the comments, do you believe those children were taken by human hands or by something far older that still lingers in the shadows? Subscribe to join me as we uncover more forgotten horrors, because stories like this should never be left to rot in silence.